So we're going to begin with Roger Ascham. So, and we're going to begin with something he said in 1547. So, now I wonder less at that saying of yours, which you repeated to me so often at court, Cambridge men are behind in many things. Thus wrote Roger Ascham to his friend John Cheek. Cheek also appears in the 17th century picture. To his friend John Cheek in 1547, and this letter was despondent. Cheek and Ascham had been young scholars together, but Cheek was no longer at Cambridge. He was now at the court, serving as tutor to the young Edward VI, also here. And we know that the reign of this boy king, he was just 9 when he took the throne from his father Henry VIII in January 1547, was a period of profound religious upheaval for England. After the years of ambiguity, the kind of half-hearted Reformation, or perhaps directionless at some points, Reformation that Henry had experienced, this was a very different period. At the behest of this new king and his advisors, there was a forceful, programmatic campaign for evangelical reform. And much of the kind of current historical literature on this tends to emphasise this, the fact that this was as close as 16th century England got really to a religious revolution. But it would seem that Ascham at least had doubts about how far such reformation was advancing in Cambridge, and his belief that Cambridge men were backwards. Perhaps some things never change, but Cheek, Ascham wrote, would scarcely believe true how completely that old vigour of the genuine doctrine has dried up, which flourished most in the last year. So, I mean, there's various ways in which we could explain this kind of apparent disappointment. Perhaps he had unfairly inflated hopes, and this is probably true. He probably thought, more was going to happen more quickly than it possibly could. But I think it is striking how different this view is to the more common view given of the University of Cambridge as a 16th century institution. The university has long been seen and studied as a prematurely Protestant institution, as a place where evangelical roots determinedly took root and spread much further and much faster than they did almost anywhere else in England. And this can be seen across the 16th century. So there's evidence that Lutheran books are circulating in Cambridge as early as 1521. By the middle of the 1520s, approximations of these ideas were being spread in Cambridge pulpits, in the sermon of Robert Barnes, who would eventually meet his end and be executed for heresy by the Henrician state in 1540. Perhaps most famously, there was a so-called White Horse Inn group, apparently a collection of university men who gathered to discuss the new theological ideas coming in from Germany in this heady first decade of Reformation. Historians have actually sounded notes of caution over this group, not least because the only good evidence we have for it comes from the writings of John Fox 40 years after it was supposed to have happened. But nonetheless, Cambridge was clearly one of the most significant sites of early Protestant ideas in England. And if we look to the other end of the 16th century, again, we find Cambridge taking the the Protestant lead. So if we think about the foundation of Sidney Sussex College in 1596, pictured much, much later here, this was a college founded explicitly as a seminary for ministers to serve the English Church. Its statutes prepared sometime later, declared that it sought the glory of God and the edification of the church by serving as a seminarium, a seminary of learned men. And these statutes were themselves based on the statutes of Emmanuel College, which had been founded 12 years earlier. And the founders of these colleges were both, Sir Marmay for Emmanuel, Lady Frances Sidney for Sidney Sussex, were both deeply motivated by their own Puritan, it's quite a controversial term, I'm going to use it I think you can probably imagine me doing this when I say Puritan so that my arm doesn't get tired. But their own Puritan beliefs, and they saw the university as a conduit for implementing these. To use the words of the historian Peter Lake, Emmanuel was a monument in bricks and mortar to the penetration of Puritan attitudes to the very centre of the Elizabethan establishment. So that is to the university. So from the beginning of the amorphous process that we might call Tudor Reformation to the end, Cambridge stands out as the epitome of Protestant progress in England. And this is largely how its history has been written. Harry Porter's work on Tudor Cambridge remains, half a century after its publication, the single most read work on Reformation Cambridge, and for good reason. It's insightful, it's inspiring, and it's valuable. But I don't think it's unfair to say that when that work was written in the 50s, its aim was to trace Protestantism and the transmission of Protestant ideas within the university, and therefore that any undercurrents that perhaps went against this story of progress naturally became somewhat shaved out. And so one obvious example here was the treatment of Cambridge under the Catholic Mary I. And in this, most of the current work focuses very much on those who left the university, those who fled this Catholic regime and went and sought refuge overseas. Until very recently, there'd been much less work on what everyone left behind was actually doing with themselves. And so this then is one issue that I seek to address in my work in general, to examine the evidence of resistance to Reformation within Cambridge, both Catholicism per se, but also the more nebulous category of conservatism. And so, with reference to the introduction, I'm afraid actually I tend to be much more interested in many ways in those who hid under their desks than I am in those who took braver stands. But more generally, as I began by saying, I'm very interested in process and in diversity of religious experience, in the idea that actually we can't attribute any one narrative to how such a diverse community experienced religious change. And that this was very complex, and that numerous factors shaped this. So again, as I said, the pressures put upon these universities by 4 different monarchs, and the fact that throughout this period, one constant, in fact, probably the only real constant across these monarchs, was they all believed the university mattered very, very much. They all believed that if you were going to get your Reformation, counter-Reformation perhaps, if you want to use it for me, if you were going to get your religious way, in essence, that you had to do it through the production of new preachers, you had to do it through the production of new clerical leaders, and therefore you needed the universities. And that there were therefore particularly pressured environments. So kind of a Privy Council letter to Cambridge in 1549 said that university men should ideally become lights to shine to the whole realm. So this idea that their conformity mattered even more so than everybody else's. But such external intervention was not the only factor. This wasn't just directed from on high, and that too is something that I really want to kind of focus on, actually particularly today. Internal dynamics could prove just as crucial, and as I said, I think we need to think about this as a space with a lot of overlapping interests, professional, but also as a space where people lived alongside each other and had personal relationships too. And so, as I said, I want to think about just a few ways in which I think we can get perhaps a bit closer to what it might have felt like to experience Reformation as a member of the University of Cambridge in the 16th century. So first then, I want to focus on some particular disputes, particular moments where people did fight, where people did have to stand up. And in many ways, it has been religious conflict that's been seen as the keynote of this period, again, particularly within the university, the idea that this was a period of particularly fierce battles being fought over issues that perhaps not, might seem trivial to us today. But I think if we look a bit closer at some of these examples, we see not just conflict, but again the moments, but also about the operation of community that these moments of particular tension disturbed. And again, this is something where I feel like it's actually particularly useful to think about this in the ways that many historians of particular kind of local communities have done, to think about the ways in which we can read our sources to tell us about what was expected to happen and how we can read from that, how we can read out from what went wrong. So I'm going to start then, I don't know how clear this is, with Queen's College in 1557 during the reign of Mary I and after England's reconciliation to the Roman Catholic Church. So it's pretty clear that there were ongoing problems within this college community at this point. And we know this because royal commissioners came to examine this college and every college to see how well it was conforming to the requirements of reimposed Catholicism. And they took depositions to this. They asked people a series of questions about the college. and they were asked about certain breaches, things that were going wrong. And it's very clear that this was partially to do with issues of religion. So there were complaints that the proper religious ceremonies weren't being observed, that they were neglecting to perform the mass as they were supposed to be, and several people pointed out the college didn't have a dean of chapel. So we can, in some ways, quite straightforwardly, perhaps read this as kind of resistance to Catholicism. The kind of Protestant institution doesn't want to be forced backwards as they might see it. But, and again, some people also said about that not enough fellows were entering holy orders, so there were too many of them were avoiding entering the priesthood. You could read that in the same way. But the answers they gave also revealed other, perhaps more social issues, and indeed a rift within the fellowship. And again, I think here we get a glimpse of what it might have been like to live within such an institution. So, among the complaints were complaints, perhaps fairly standard ones, complaints about gambling, complaints about quarrels, about people who other people felt were unnecessarily provocative in college meetings. There were complaints about not attending college events as well. And there were complaints that there was a simple lack of clear control here, a simple lack of clear government. So one of the fellows, when questioned, said the problem was that no one knew what had and had not been agreed among them. So that in fact this on the surface of it, purely religious issue actually became entwined with a much broader kind of social breakdown of fellowship within this one space. There were also, in all this kind of talks of factions and threats, there were also issues, there were kind of signs that older issues were emerging. So two particular fellows had been, as the others put it, forced into the college under Edward VI, so under this radical Protestant regime. And again, it's difficult to know how to read this. It's difficult to know whether this is purely about the fact that these people are seen as Protestant, and whether Catholic fellows object to this, or whether in fact there's a broader issue here about kind of self-governance and about having people forced upon you whether or not you want it. So I think we can see here some of the ways in which religious tensions were shaped by and interwoven with their social settings and their institutional settings. Religious conflict was clearly important, but it was not religious conflict alone that had pushed these men to this point. And incidentally, by this point, they had reached the point of physical threats, one of them reported. One of them complained that one of his colleagues had threatened to drag him around the room by his hair. He wouldn't do it, but... and I think that we can see here the ways in which religion was clearly central, but also much part of a much broader pattern. I think we can see some thematic similarities, but also some key differences if we jump forward, and a very little bit across Cambridge, to King's College in 1576. So by this point, Elizabeth I had been on the throne for 18 years, and King's was on its second Elizabethan head of house, provost, King speak, Roger Goad. So, and this man had taken over the head of house under unusual circumstances. His predecessor had actually run away. He had been accused of being a secret Catholic under this Protestant regime. There had been a long investigation and drawn-out investigation over many years, and eventually he simply left. He simply kind of up sticks and went. I'm actually still not entirely sure where he went to. There's various different options, various different theories. So his successor then had been, so Roger Goad had been someone who had complained about this kind of Catholic head of house and had helped to see him out of the way, and had then taken over the job. But soon he himself was also attacked. And in 1576, some of the fellows of the college put forward a series of complaints about this man. We have a bit of a source problem here. One of the most we know about this actually comes from his reply to the complaints, so we have to sort of a little bit guess what they had been accusing him of by what he said to defend himself. It's clear that they accused him of financial misdealing, and this also reminds us of the fact that this is a community that it has a very complicated interrelationship on many levels, including the monetary. But his defence also makes it clear that the accusations had also included his personal morality. Goad objected to the suggestion that he had indulged in loose and lewd living, He called such accusations slanders. And in a separate document detailing the crimes with which he had been slanderously charged, Goad listed uncleanness of life not to be named. I don't think I need to name it either. Importantly, there's also reference to previous religious conflicts during the college, though. So he defends his decision to take students away from one of the college fellows, a Master Dunning, because he said the man himself was a Catholic. And he said Goad said he found it too dangerous an idea to allow an alleged Catholic to teach students, and therefore that he had done correctly in expelling this man from where he had influence over impressionable youth. But it's clear that the religious components were very central here, and he defends himself in a number of ways, including saying that he had done much to encourage the reading of scripture during his time in the college, and he had also tried to increase the number of preachers too. But again, this is clearly bound up with issues that are harder to divide simply into religious or non-religious, and one of these, in fact, was his wife. And this itself is perhaps, it's very clear that she was criticised personally, and it's very hard to know how far this is about her, whether she was disliked, or how far this was in fact about the kind of post-Reformation, the greater kind of role of masters' wives, including those in holy orders, in this post-Reformation world. But it's also clear that in many ways, as far as we can tell, his opponents didn't really know what to accuse him of. So in some ways, they accused him of being overly zealous as a Protestant, essentially of being a Puritan. So they complained, for instance, he'd got rid of the organs in the college chapel, which presumably was a claim that he was overly zealous here. But they also accused him of not eating in hall on festival days, which presumably was a suggestion that he was keeping up Catholic practices surrounding fasting, and that was why he refused to eat with the other fellows on days where meat would have been forbidden. And I think this perhaps tells us something as well, because I think this tells us something about the ways in which religion was clearly a very real issue within these college conflicts, but also, in a way that is perhaps familiar to us all, real issues can also be used in ways when other conflicts come to the surface. So that it seemed quite likely that his opponents were in fact casting around for things to accuse him of. And in fact, an investigation into the charges seems to have exonerated him. Those who had criticised him were forced to apologise. Though it is worth saying that he had some very powerful friends in very high positions, including William Cecil as chief advisor, who seemed to have intervened personally on his behalf. So it perhaps was quite helpful who he knew as well. And in fact, later he would be appointed as one of the people to publicly dispute against Catholics on behalf of the state. So it's clear there weren't serious doubts about his conformity, and he'd remain head of kings until he died in 1610. So his guilt, therefore, looks very questionable indeed, and these charges are normally just seen as entirely spurious. But I think what they do tell us, what these charges tell us, and again, this is about how we read our sources, is again something about the perceptions, even if not the reality, of religious nonconformity. And viewed in this light, I think they're actually a particularly good example, because doctrine wasn't the major focus of this case, but it was absolutely central. But it's quite difficult to fit these, as I said, neatly. It feels like this is a bit of a case of mud being thrown until some of it sticks. And I think that tells us something too about kind of the ways in which nonconformity was perceived, and particularly the fact this was seen as part of a wider moral failing. So bad leadership and bad religion weren't separable in these complaints. They were part of exactly the same problem. I think they also tell us something about the ways in which these disputes were shaped by the university, or university college in this case, as a social and domestic space, as well as a professional one, and indeed primarily a religious one. So I think the issue of Goad's wife, for instance, hints at this, the ways in which there were broader dimensions to this. And there are many other examples that might suggest this. So, for instance, to use another example, if we think about accusations of popery, of Catholicism in Gomble and Caius College in the 1580s, these disputes are very, very complicated, and I'm not going to go into them right now, but again, they can only be understood in their collegiate institutional settings. So, in fact, sheer physical proximity was a really important part of this. So in Gonville and Keys, one of the reasons that the master of the college was accused of complicity in non-conformity on the part of his students was that it was said that they kept their papistical books, their Catholic books, in his chamber. And therefore, and indeed that one of them was wearing a crucifix under his clothes. And I think this tells us something about a shared life, perhaps much more intimate than we would expect, and the ways in which this too could help us to understand these moments of religious strife, and to help us to understand how we might put them in a communal and in a social context. We also, I think, have to think about the ways in which the sense of community might also not just enable religious conflict, but might actually also mitigate against it. Because one of the other things that the disputes in King shows is actually how very slow burning such conflicts were. We see them at the point where they come to the surface, but if we go back to Go's predecessor, we go back to Philip Baker, the man who was accused of Catholicism, it turns out that it took 6 years for anyone to think it was worth reporting that the college hadn't been holding Protestant services. And that, I think, in itself tells us something, not necessarily about resistance to Protestantism, but instead about the ways in which a community might close ranks, about the very strong pressures against conflict as well as in favour of them. And so this then, to me, seems to suggest different, less visible currents of religious change within the straightforward narrative of Tudor Cambridge as Protestant triumph. And the same is true, in quite a different way, of the final of these moments of particular tension that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about some other textual evidence briefly. But, and this final piece comes from 1573, when the university complained again, they went to higher authority, they went to the Chancellor, William Cecil. They complained that 2 men had recently preached unorthodox sermons, that they had stood up in public, and the sermons were both in Great St. Mary's, in fact. They had preached these sermons, and they had done so as an attack on their superiors. So we can see this in the sermons of one of these men, a man called John Browning. So Browning gave a sermon in which it was said that he had accused those of he had attacked those who had ever slid backwards, that is, those who had ever strayed away from Protestant truth. But he had not just done so in general. He'd actually said that it was suggested that he had singled out some particular man who, in the time of our Josiah, Edward VI, it was quite a common biblical comparison to be made for him, the particular man who, in the time of our Josiah, renounced the work of darkness, but who had subsequently reneged and gone back to Catholicism under Mary. So again, somebody who had hid under their table, not just once, but twice, kind of managing to see through these different reigns. And he had the preacher, Browning, had criticised anyone who would allow such a man, a massmonger repenting, he called him, into the church. And indeed, he said that under a true Josiah, such a man would have been the first that should be sacrificed. So this is the Tudor equivalent of backs up against the first with the backs up against the wall. And so he's suggesting, in fact, quite a serious response to this apparent non-conformity. And we know who he's talking about, because we know that he had apparently said that he was talking about a man who had defaced in the time of Queen Mary a worthy, learned man. Now, to understand this, we have to go back a bit. We have to go back, in fact, before Elizabeth's reign and back to the reigns of both of her siblings. So we first start by going back to the reign of Edward VI. So as I said, under Edward, a zealously Protestant religious policy was implemented both in Cambridge and elsewhere, and as part of this, prominent continental theologians were placed within both English universities, and in Cambridge it was the theologians Martin Bucer, published here, and his colleague Paul Fagius, who were fleeing to Strasbourg, who arrived in Cambridge in 1549. Fagius only lasted a few months. They were both ill when they arrived. Fagius died later that year. Bucer, however, died in 1551. And Boots in particular was greatly celebrated and mourned. There was a public funeral, and he was presented really as the kind of ultimate example of Cambridge as this light to the nation, this ultimate example of how the universities could be at the forefront of bringing true religion, bringing Protestantism, as they saw it, the true religion as they saw it, into the world. But under the Catholic Queen Mary, however, the two men were condemned as heretics, and indeed in 1557 their bodies were exhumed and burned in the marketplace on market day, incidentally, so that this could be a lesson not just to the university but also to kind of general populace of Cambridge. So they were tried as heretics, obviously after their death. They were tried as heretics and found guilty, and their corpses were burnt. And subsequently, much of the blame for this was placed upon one man, Andrew Carpen, as a master of Peterhouse, who had been the university vice-chancellor at the time of this public display. And there were two reasons for this. Firstly, Carpen had been apparently a friend and a follower of Butzer during his life, and he was also, by quite a deep unfortunate coincidence really, he was vice-chancellor in 1557 when those bodies were burned. He was vice-chancellor again in 1560 under Elizabeth when the university carried out a public ceremony of atonement, an apology for the burning. So he managed to be there both for the atrocity and for the apology for it, which made him look rather hypocritical, and he was widely criticised as such at the time. In fact, he became quite a widely known and derided figure, nicknamed Carpen the Turncoat. And so it's pretty clear this is who Browning's talking about when he talks about that word, the man, the massmonger who had defaced in the time of Queen Mary a worthy, learned man. He's talking about Carpen, and he's talking about this treatment, the desecration of the corpses. And in the other controversial sermon of the time, we find many of the same themes. Again, we find that Carpen is personally being criticised as somebody who has turned in this way, who has hypocritically gone through 3 different religious regimes and managed to kind of make his peace with all of them. So he's criticised for this. And the particular complaint is that he's still allowed within that he's still a central figure within the university. He's still a head of house. He's still one of the university seniors. That this is actually one of the most important people in the university community who has this kind of shameful history as they see it. Now, I'm not suggesting that these kinds of complaints tell us something about the actual numbers of Catholics, or as they would call them, papists within the university. Andrew Carpen, it's fairly clear, wasn't a Catholic in that sense. But I think it does tell, and both men were very much motivated by their own Puritan beliefs, but I think it does tell us something about the ways in which they saw the university, and the ways in which, in fact, the narrative that historians are most familiar with, the narrative of this as a purely Protestant institution, matches up very badly to how they felt about the fact that such a senior figure could have this shameful past. And he probably wasn't these people probably weren't the only ones who felt the events of the 1550s were still relevant well into the 1570s. That the university's past hadn't just been shaken off all at once when Elizabeth came to the throne. And I'd suggest this actually offers a slightly different perspective, and in perhaps even a different timeline of religious change. A timeline that emphasised, albeit very negatively, continuity over change, and which saw high relevance in the recently popish past, even within a now reformed university. And so this then too rounds out our understanding of religious experience in the university and gives, I would argue, a much better sense of how Reformation might have felt to these people, that they just didn't necessarily feel as if they were living within the godly institution that historians might tell them they were. And there are other ways too, I think, that we can access perhaps what we might call alternative timelines of change, ways in which we can see continuity within change, and also different paces of change to that imposed by official reformations. So one such example is what we might call the physical aspects of change, the series of removals, refashioning and purchases that the different Tudor settlements required. And so again, to think about this as a physical space too. So for the past 20 years or so, and Aidan Duffy's stripping of the altars is kind of classic work here. But there's been much discussion of this aspect of religious change at a parish level. And again, I think this is somewhere where all Reformation historians have taken much inspiration from local studies. The church wardens' accounts in particular have been much mined for such assessments to try and work out what people were actually doing in response to the religious changes they were told to implement. And for Cambridge, excellent information survives on this, primarily in college financial accounts, and is known. But much of this has been discussed in quite fragmentary ways in individual college histories, rather than being kind of pulled together and seeing what kind of picture that gives us. So if we take, for instance, the reign of Edward VI, one of the many ways in which this regime proved much more radically and concertedly evangelical than that of Edward's father, Henry VIII, was in its requirements for changes to the fabrics of churches. And we see some very prompt evidence of such change in Cambridge. So in Christ College, for instance, in the first year of Edward's reign, the college accounts tell us that a payment was made for helping down with images, which I think is a rather lovely phrase for what was presumably a much more destructive activity than it suggests. In Queen's College, similarly, the images were apparently removed from the chapel in October 1547. And such actions were presumably a response to the national call for abused images, so images that were felt to be unnecessarily superstitious, that were being used in superstitious way, Catholic ways as they saw them. And it's not clear whether or not they were removing all images or just those narrowly required by legislation. And then the following year, the requirement was changed to the removal of all such images, and it was presumably this that prompted the decision that the walls of the University Church, Great St Mary, should be whitewashed and decorated with scriptural quotation, rather than retaining its decoration. Colleges began to sell off some of their now defunct Catholic goods, and the abolition of altars in Cambridge also followed dutifully, but perhaps not hastily. And so again, some colleges began to purchase communion tables almost immediately. And so Queen's College and Christ College both seem to have removed their altars very quickly. And Trinity College had purchased a communion table by 1550. But some other colleges seem to have only acted when they were pushed. So, for instance, both Peterhouse, which was using the Church of St Mary the Less as its college chapel, removed its altars in 1551, as did Corpus Christi. And this was clearly a direct response to this was now required, this was now something the government demanded. And this demand from the government actually came following the widespread destruction of altars that was already taking place in many places from October 1548. So actually, we know that, for instance, in London, many altars were already being removed in a very widespread way by 1549. And so in such a context, the actions of Queens and Christ then show acquiescence, certainly. They show they were willing to do what they were told, but perhaps not more than this. Such motives are, of course, a topic on which these sources can tell us very little. They can tell us something about what they did, then of course very partial sources. The great bane of my research life when I was working on this for my thesis was the phrase purchase of things that were necessary for the chapel, which I'm sure made perfect sense to the person making out the accounts, but it's very unhelpful for a historian. But so such sources can tell us a bit about what they did, but obviously they can't tell us why they did it, they can't tell us how they felt about it. And also colleges tell us what they do, what accounts tell us what people do, but we can only infer from absence to guess what they didn't do. We can never really be sure what's remaining, because that's not so easily tracked. And certainly later, under Elizabeth, we find some surprising delays. So Christ College sold quite a lot of mass goods, as they called them, in a decade after Elizabeth came to the throne. One of the things, in fact, that Philip Baker, that much attacked head of kings that I told you about earlier, one of the things he was accused of was deliberately hoarding Catholic goods and waiting in presumably the belief they'd be useful again. And this, again, I think, places change at a different time scale. And it actually also helps us to understand one of those moments of conflict I discussed earlier. Because again, from one perspective, the claims of people like John Browning, the preacher I mentioned earlier, who said, who felt that he was living in an unreformed university, from one perspective, these look kind of like quite strange complaints and kind of as clearly the kind of work of an overzealous person as we might see it. On the other hand, we might want to bear in mind that he probably was speaking in a church that which only a year earlier had still borne the physical marks of Catholic decoration, because it was only in the early 1570s that the rood screen, the holes left by the rood screen in Great St Mary's were covered up, so the screen went earlier. But so this was a place that sort of literally still bore some scars of an earlier religious age. So these kinds of records, again, offer us a different perspective, and I would argue bring us closer to the experience of religious change in the university. There are also other ways to do this, and I want to end this afternoon's talk by focusing reasonably briefly, perhaps prepared to know, on just one of these, wills. So again, these are documents that have been very widely used in other contexts and which have been very important for Reformation historians, again, particularly gaining inspiration from local studies. There has been some work on Cambridge's wills, particularly on what they revealed to us about book ownership, but I think there is still more potential to draw kind of a bit more out of this very rich set of records. I'm not going to talk in any kind of holistic way about this evidence, but I just want to discuss a couple of wills and what they might tell us about how religious change might have felt. So in some ways, wills can provide very immediate evidence of religious change within the university. So, for instance, the will of Thomas Merrill, a fellow of St John's. So Merrill was making his final preparations for his death in the opening months of the reign of Elizabeth I, and in many ways we can see it as reminiscent of an earlier age. His will, prepared in December 1558, bears all the hallmarks of someone who had been very at ease under the restored Catholicism of Mary I. He entrusts his salvation to God and to the intercession of our Blessed Lady St. Mary and all the blessed company of heaven, so he appeals to the saints, and he requires a yearly mass for his soul. Among his bequests were a number of Catholic chapel goods as well. By January, though, these requests had already become unacceptable, and we can actually see this. So his gifts of chapel goods were subsequently crossed out, that's the line here, as was his request for masses for his soul. And in fact, the changes, this very short change of time, had even made his choice of executor unacceptable, because the man he had specified, Thomas Bailey, the master of Clare Hall, had already at this point left the university upon Elizabeth's accession and gone into exile in Catholic Europe. So his name was also crossed out from the will. So I think this will very neatly exemplifies a moment of time, a moment where the boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable were shifting incredibly quickly, and therefore we can see in these kind of scribbling outs perhaps a wider process in which people were having to very quickly work out where they stood in a very shifting religious world. There are other ways too that wills can allow us to glimpse the experience of religious change in the university. So Thomas Merbury, a student at Christ College, doesn't seem to have written his will in any state of urgency. He says he's in perfect health, he says he's in perfect body and mind. But the original date on this will, and this is what you can sort of see happening up here, the original date on this will was crossed out and replaced with the day before. So the original date is September 1569. This was replaced with the 1st of December 1571, the day before Merbury's death. And so what this suggests is that this will did in fact prove useful because, unfortunately, tragically, he was very young. He did die very shortly afterwards. But that the will hadn't been prepared for this purpose. The will had been prepared for something rather different. And I would suggest it had actually been prepared for a much more personal purpose for this young student. The will he produced might give rise to suspicions that this was as much a theological declaration as it was a legal document. He spent almost a page of the will setting out his own religious beliefs. And this was a very normal thing to do in a will, but not at this kind of length. And he not only endorsed Protestant teachings, but he also condemned Catholic doctrine, claiming that he did utterly reject, detest and abhor the doctrine of good works as injurious, and calling the doctrine of purgatory the fond opinion of the papists. He also laid out his wishes for his funeral service, insisting it should be without all pomp, vainglory or superstitious faction. And we know from the bequests of the world that he counted some of Cambridge's leading Puritans among his friends, or at least those who he felt he wanted to leave money to, and his works included, we know he owned the works of Calvin and Bullinger. So this was surely somebody who would have considered himself part of this kind of Puritan movement, and his will, the declarations in his will are perhaps part of this, one space for him to work out his own religious identity. And it seems likely this was designed primarily as a private rather than a public exercise, and perhaps therefore part of his own process of religious reflection. This process, this kind of searching for identity, and also this hardening of confessional boundaries, this working out where you stood in this complex and fractured and changing world, there is another important aspect of religious change in the university. And I think this will represents one very rare moment where we can kind of see this happening in front of our eyes. We have to assume it was a much broader process. Wills also give us a good indication of social networks, and here we find perhaps surprising things. We find that wills don't seem to suggest that it was possible for social networks to not be entirely defined by religious faction, so that for those who seem to have stood on different sides of the religious divide to continue to consider themselves at least close enough to be a beneficiary of a will. It also, incidentally, the wills also show us, I would suggest, in some cases, that the boundaries between town and gown were also a bit more porous than is often suggested, that the relationships there, which aren't necessarily so visible in other types of sources, are also interesting. So wills, again, then, I think, will show us that, that this is a different kind of timescale, a different story of religious change, a different story, a kind of caveat to the narrative of conflict that could so easily dominate this period, and a suggestion that for many people's lives, this wasn't the only or most dominant feature of religious change for them. Okay, so I'm going to end now. This has been, I suppose, a rather kind of meandering tour of Tudor Cambridge, and as I kind of warned at the beginning, a collection of anecdotes and examples rather than one coherent narrative. Without trying to engage in too much kind of final self-justification, I'd like to suggest that this is in fact kind of the point. I don't want to reject the idea of Puritan Cambridge, and I certainly don't want to replace it with an idea of conservative Cambridge. I don't think it's a useful exercise, I also don't think it's true. Rather, what I'd like to do is to try and capture at least a little bit of the diversity of reactions to and experiences of Reformation in the Tudor University. Ultimately, the story I'm telling here isn't actually a very surprising one. That Reformation affected and complicated the communal lives of this institution, or again, this kind of overlapping series of institutions, is obvious. And so too is it obvious that both individuals and communities within the institution must have shaped their own responses, that people must have, in fact, reacted in a diversity of ways to the demands being placed upon them by this particularly tumultuous religious age. But such patterns, the kind of weft and warp of religious change, have received very little attention from the university compared to the kind of doctrinal, theological battles that were fought within it, compared to the moments of highest conflict. And indeed, some of the evidence lies in quite different places as well. So it lies in the potentially, I would argue not entirely, dry world of accounts and wills rather than the world of polemic and conflict. And as I said, I do think here that much credit has to go to the many ways in which local historians have forced us to think very differently about the Reformation as a process. But I would argue that this world, even if it is found in kind of dry account books, this world, the world of complicated, incremental change, the time where both continuity and discontinuity carried religious charge, I think this world comes much closer, I'm sure it's still a very imperfect view, it comes much closer to the experience of Reformation for the majority in this unique, important, but ultimately, of course, still human Tudor institution. Okay, well, thank you very much.